The old woman's cane cracked against the marble floor as she stumbled, and the laughter that followed was sharper than the sound itself. Eleanor Whitfield turned toward the noise before she even decided to move. Across the crowded assembly room, 3 young ladies in silk gowns stood in a loose circle around an elderly woman who was struggling to steady herself. Her gray hair had slipped from its pins, and her old gown, though clean and carefully mended, looked faded next to the glittering fashions around her. One of the young ladies, a sharp-faced girl named Charlotte Price, pointed at the woman's shoes and said something behind her fan. The others laughed again. Eleanor did not know the old woman. She did not know her name, her family, or why she had come to the assembly alone. None of that mattered. What mattered was the way the woman's hands trembled as she tried to gather herself, and the way no one in the room moved to help her. Eleanor crossed the floor before her mind caught up with her feet.
Is something amusing?
She asked, stopping beside the old woman and offering her arm without waiting for an answer. Charlotte's smile faltered for only a moment. We were simply remarking on the fashion, Miss Whitfield. Some people do not keep up with the times. Some people, Eleanor said, have lived through more winters than you have lived years, and deserve better manners than you are showing tonight. A ripple of whispers moved through the nearby guests. Eleanor felt the heat rise in her cheeks, but she did not look away from Charlotte's narrowed eyes. She had spoken without thinking, the way she always did when cruelty stood in front of her, and now there was no taking the words back. How dare you, Charlotte said, her voice climbing. You forget yourself, Miss Whitfield. You are hardly in a position to lecture anyone on manners, given your own family's circumstances. Eleanor felt the old insult land, the one about her father's debts and her modest dowry, the one that followed her to every gathering in London like a shadow she could not shake. She had heard it before. She would likely hear it again. But tonight she refused to let it silence her. My circumstances, Eleanor said calmly, have nothing to do with kindness. You might try it sometime. It costs nothing, though it seems to be in short supply among your friends. Someone near the punch table laughed, a real laugh, not the cruel kind, and Charlotte's face went scarlet. She opened her mouth to answer, then closed it again, clearly aware that the room had turned its attention toward her, instead of toward the old woman she had meant to embarrass. With a sharp turn of her skirts, she withdrew, her 2 companions trailing behind her like reluctant ducklings. The room had not fully returned to its usual rhythm. Eleanor could feel eyes lingering on her from every direction, some curious, some disapproving, a few faintly admiring. She had grown used to being watched in London drawing rooms, though usually for the wrong reasons. Tonight felt different. Tonight the attention had a weight to it, as though something had shifted in the air, and no one was quite sure what to make of it yet. Only then did Eleanor turn to the woman beside her. Are you hurt? She asked gently. The old woman shook her head. Up close, Eleanor could see her eyes were a clear, pale gray, sharp with an intelligence that did not match the frailty of her hands. There was something in the set of her jaw, something dignified and unbothered, as though the mockery of a few young ladies had barely touched her at all. I am quite well, my dear, the woman said. Her voice was soft but steady, cultured in a way that made Eleanor suddenly wonder if she had misjudged the situation entirely. Though I confess I did not expect a rescue tonight. You did not need rescuing, Eleanor said. You needed someone to say what should have been obvious to everyone in this room. The old woman studied her for a long moment, the kind of look that made Eleanor feel as though she were being measured against some invisible standard. Tell me your name, child. Eleanor Whitfield. Whitfield, the woman repeated, as though turning the name over to see what it might reveal. She glanced at Eleanor's gown, plain compared to the silks around them, then back at her face, and something in her expression softened further. You did not have to speak up for me, you know. Most young ladies in your position would have looked away. It is safer, and far less costly, to look away. I have never found looking away particularly comfortable, Eleanor said. It tends to sit badly with me afterward. A troublesome habit for a young woman trying to make her way in society, the old woman observed, though there was no real criticism in her tone. Perhaps, Eleanor said, but I would rather be troublesome and able to look at myself honestly than agreeable and ashamed. The old woman's gaze sharpened with new interest. And tell me, Miss Whitfield, do you always speak so plainly to strangers who insult you? Only when the insult is undeserved, Eleanor said, which in my experience it usually is. A faint smile crossed the old woman's face, there and gone so quickly that Eleanor almost missed it. That is a rare quality in a room such as this one. Most people here have learned to measure their words very carefully, and to save their honesty for those who cannot punish them for it. Then most people here are cowards, Eleanor said, before she could stop herself, and immediately wondered if she had gone too far. But the old woman only laughed, a low, surprised sound that seemed to catch even her by surprise. "You are refreshingly bold, Miss Whitfield. I hope London does not teach you to be otherwise." Before Eleanor could ask her name in return, a young footman appeared at the woman's elbow, bowing low and murmuring something Eleanor could not hear. The old woman's expression shifted, growing more careful, more guarded, as though a door had quietly closed behind her eyes. "I am afraid I must go," she said. "But I will not forget your kindness tonight, Miss Whitfield. Kindness like yours is rarer than you know." "Wait," Eleanor said. "You have not told me your name." The old woman only smiled again, that same brief, knowing smile, and allowed the footman to guide her toward the door. Eleanor watched her go, weaving through the crowd with more grace than her earlier stumble had suggested, until she disappeared into the corridor beyond the ballroom. Eleanor stood alone for a moment, feeling the weight of dozens of eyes still upon her. She could hear the whispers starting already, the way gossip moved through a room like smoke, curling into every corner before anyone admitted to lighting the fire. "Well," said a familiar voice at her shoulder, "that was either the bravest thing I have ever seen you do, or the most foolish." Eleanor turned to find her closest friend, Lucy Bennet, watching her with a mixture of admiration and worry. "Perhaps both," Eleanor admitted. "Charlotte Price will not forget this," Lucy said, glancing toward the corner where Charlotte stood whispering furiously with her friends, casting dark looks in Eleanor's direction. "She has a long memory for slights, real or imagined." "Let her remember it then," Eleanor said. Though her heart was beating faster than she wanted to admit, someone needed to say something. No one else was going to. "That is exactly what worries me about you," Lucy said, but she said it fondly, looping her arm through Eleanor's. "Come, let us find somewhere quieter before Charlotte decides to make a scene of her own." They moved toward the edge of the room, away from the dancing and the candlelight, and Eleanor allowed herself to finally exhale. Her hands were still trembling slightly, though whether from anger or nerves, she could not say. She thought of the old woman's pale gray eyes, sharp and knowing, and the strange feeling that had passed through her when the woman studied her so carefully, as though searching for something Eleanor could not name. "You are shaking," Lucy said, noticing. "I am fine," Eleanor said. Though she accepted the glass of lemonade Lucy pressed into her hand all the same. "It is only that I have never spoken to a duchess quite like that before." "A duchess?" Lucy's eyebrows lifted. "What makes you think she was a duchess?" Eleanor hesitated. She could not explain it fully, not even to herself. It had been something in the way the old woman carried herself despite her trembling hands, something in the calm authority beneath her soft voice, and the way the footman had bowed so low when he came to fetch her, lower than one bowed for an ordinary guest. "I do not know that she was," Eleanor admitted. "It was only a feeling." "Well, duchess or not, you have made an enemy of Charlotte Price tonight, and that is no small thing," Lucy said, though her tone remained light. "Her mother sits on every committee that matters, and Charlotte will not forgive being humbled in front of half of London." "Then I shall have to manage without Charlotte Price's good opinion," Eleanor said. "I have managed without it for years already." Lucy laughed, and for a moment the tension of the evening eased between them, replaced by the familiar comfort of old friendship. But even as they spoke of ordinary things, Eleanor's mind kept returning to the old woman's parting words, and the strange promise buried inside them. "Kindness like yours is rarer than you know." It was an odd thing to say to a stranger, as though the woman had already decided that their paths were not finished crossing. "Did you see who she left with?" Lucy asked suddenly, glancing toward the door. "No. A footman came for her. I did not even learn her name." "Strange," Lucy said. "I have never seen her before tonight, and I know nearly every family that matters in London. Whoever she is, she does not attend assemblies often." Eleanor glanced once more toward the empty doorway, an odd, unplaceable feeling settling in her chest. There had been something in the old woman's manner, some quiet authority beneath the frailty, that did not match her worn gown or her trembling hands. Eleanor told herself it did not matter. She had done what was right, and that was the end of it. She could not have known, standing there in the warm, gossip-thick air of the assembly room, that the encounter was only the beginning. She could not have known that within the week, an invitation would arrive at her door bearing no name, only an address on one of the grandest streets in London, and that the woman she had defended without a second thought would change the entire course of her life. For now, she only knew that she did not regret a single word she had spoken. Whatever came of it, she would not have stayed silent. She never could. The music resumed behind them, and Lucy pulled her gently back toward the light, back into the glittering, watchful crowd, where Charlotte Price's cold stare followed Eleanor across the room, like a promise of trouble yet to come. Eleanor lifted her chin and walked forward anyway, unaware that far more than gossip was already beginning to move in motion around her, set into place by a single act of kindness toward a stranger whose name she still did not know. The letter arrived without warning on a gray Tuesday morning, sealed with plain wax and bearing no crest, no family name, only a single initial pressed into the seal. Eleanor turned it over twice before opening it, a strange unease settling in her stomach. The handwriting inside was elegant, spare, and clearly practiced. Miss Whitfield, it read, I would be glad of your company for tea on Thursday at 3 o'clock. The address follows below. Come alone if you are able. M. Eleanor read the note 3 times before she fully believed it. The address belonged to one of the grandest streets in London, a row of townhouses so imposing that she had only ever walked past them, never through their doors. Her first instinct was refusal. She did not know this M, did not know why she had been summoned, and every rule of caution she had ever been taught told her to decline an invitation from a stranger who would not even give a full name. She set the letter down on her writing desk and stared at it as though it might explain itself further if she waited long enough. Outside her window, the street was quiet, the kind of gray morning that made London feel smaller than it truly was, pressed close under low clouds. She thought of her father, downstairs in his study, poring over ledgers that never seemed to balance in their favor, and of her brother's school fees, due again at the end of the month. A mysterious invitation from a wealthy household was, she told herself firmly, no business of hers to accept out of mere curiosity. And yet the thought would not leave her alone. And yet, she thought of the old woman's pale gray eyes, the dignity beneath her trembling hands, the strange warmth in her final words. Kindness like yours is rarer than you know. Eleanor folded the letter carefully and tucked it into her writing desk, already knowing, somewhere beneath her caution, that she would go. You cannot be serious, Lucy said, when Eleanor showed her the note 2 days later. A letter with no name, asking you to come alone? Eleanor, that is exactly the sort of thing sensible young women are warned against. I know how it looks, Eleanor said, but I do not think it is dangerous. I think it is her, the woman from the assembly. You do not know that. I feel it, Eleanor said, and though she knew it was not the strongest argument, it was the only one she had. Something about the way she looked at me before she left, as though she meant to see me again. Lucy studied her for a long moment, clearly torn between worry and curiosity. If you insist on going, then at least tell me the address, so that someone knows where you are. Eleanor agreed, more to ease her friend's mind than her own, and on Thursday afternoon she dressed carefully in her best gown, a pale blue muslin that had been mended twice at the hem but still looked respectable in the right light, and set out on foot toward the grand street she had only ever admired from a distance. The townhouse, when she reached it, was even more imposing up close. Tall windows framed in white stone rose 3 stories above the street, and the black iron gate swung open before she had even lifted her hand to the latch, as though she had been expected and watched for. A footman in dark livery bowed and led her through a marble entrance hall lined with portraits, up a curved staircase, and into a bright, high-ceilinged sitting room where afternoon light fell in long gold bars across a polished floor. Eleanor could not help but glance at the portraits as she passed. Stern-faced men in fine coats and women in elegant gowns looked down from gilded frames, generation after generation of a family whose name she still did not know. One portrait in particular caught her eye, a young man with dark hair and unusually serious eyes, painted perhaps 10 years earlier if his youthful face was any indication. She wondered briefly who he was, then dismissed the thought as the footman opened a final set of doors and announced her arrival in a voice that echoed faintly against the high ceiling. The old woman was already seated by the window, a tea service laid out before her on a low table. She looked different in daylight, still frail in her movements but somehow more solid, more certain of herself, dressed now in a fine gown of soft gray silk rather than the worn dress she had worn at the assembly. Eleanor understood at once that the shabby clothing from that night had not been an accident of circumstance. It had been a choice. Miss Whitfield, the old woman said, rising slightly to greet her. I am so glad you came. I confess I almost did not, Eleanor admitted, taking the seat offered to her. A letter with no name is not the sort of thing one accepts lightly. No, the woman agreed, a faint smile touching her mouth. I imagine it is not. Forgive the mystery. I find that people behave very differently once they know exactly who they are speaking to, and I wish to speak with you honestly before that happened. And who am I speaking to? Eleanor asked, unable to hold the question back any longer. The old woman poured tea into 2 delicate cups before answering, taking her time in a way that suggested she was choosing her words carefully. My name is Margaret. That will do for now, if you do not mind. Eleanor accepted the cup, sensing that pressing further would gain her nothing. Very well, Margaret. May I ask why you have invited me here? Directness, Margaret said approvingly. I admire that in a person. Very well. I shall be direct in return. I wish to know more of the young woman who defended a stranger without asking what it might cost her. Such people are rarer than they should be, and I confess I was curious to learn whether your kindness that night was the whole truth of your character, or only a single bright moment in an otherwise ordinary life. I hope it was not only a single moment, Eleanor said, though I cannot promise I am always so bold. Sometimes I speak before I think, and it gets me into more trouble than I would like. Trouble born of honesty is a different kind of trouble than most people cause, Margaret said. Tell me about yourself, Miss Whitfield, your family, your circumstances, your days. I find I wish to know a great deal more than a single evening aloud. And so Eleanor told her. She spoke of her father, whose modest estate had never quite recovered from a series of poor investments, and her mother, who had passed 3 years earlier, leaving Eleanor to manage the household with a steadiness that surprised even herself. She spoke of her younger brother, still at school, whose future depended on funds the family did not entirely have. She spoke, hesitantly at first and then more freely, of her love of books, her impatience with empty flattery, and her stubborn refusal to pretend an admiration she did not feel, simply to please a room full of strangers. Margaret listened to all of it without interruption, her sharp gray eyes never leaving Eleanor's face, occasionally asking a question that cut straight to the heart of whatever Eleanor had just described. What do you want, Miss Whitfield, that you have not yet allowed yourself to ask for? Do you resent the position your family's circumstances have placed you in? If you could choose any life at all, unburdened by expectation, what would you choose? The questions were unlike any Eleanor had been asked before, unlike the polite, empty conversation of most drawing rooms, and she found herself answering with more honesty than she had intended, drawn out by the older woman's quiet, unwavering attention. You ask a great many questions for someone who has told me almost nothing about herself, Eleanor finally said, when the tea had gone cool in its cups and the afternoon light had shifted lower across the floor. Margaret laughed softly. Fair enough. I am an old woman who has spent a great many years surrounded by people who tell me only what they think I wish to hear. It is a lonely way to live, though I did not always understand that when I was young. Meeting someone who speaks plainly, without calculation, is a gift I did not expect to receive this season. Then I am glad to have given it, Eleanor said, even if I still do not entirely understand why. You will, Margaret said, and there was something in her tone, gentle but certain, that made Eleanor's curiosity sharpen rather than settle. In time, you will understand a great deal more than you do now. But for today, I am simply glad of your company, and I hope you will return. I would like that, Eleanor said, surprising herself with how true the words felt. As the visit drew to a close and Eleanor rose to leave, Margaret took her hand between both of her own, a small, unexpected gesture of affection that caught Eleanor off guard. Thank you again, my dear, for what you did that night. You could not have known what it meant to me, but I promise you, it meant a great deal. I only said what needed saying, Eleanor said. Yes, Margaret said quietly, and so few people ever do. The footman led Eleanor back down the curved staircase and out through the tall front doors, and as she stepped onto the street, she glanced back once at the imposing townhouse, its windows catching the last of the afternoon light. She still did not know Margaret's full name, her family, or why the mystery around her felt so carefully constructed, but she found, walking home through the busy London streets, that she did not mind the uncertainty nearly as much as she should have. There was something in Margaret's company that felt less like a stranger's curiosity, and more like the beginning of a friendship Eleanor had not known she needed, and beneath that feeling, quiet and unexamined, was the sense that she had stepped, without quite realizing it, onto a path that would lead somewhere far larger than a simple afternoon tea. When she reached home, Lucy was waiting in the front hall, unable to contain her impatience a moment longer. Well, was it her? What happened? You must tell me everything. Eleanor laughed despite herself, still light with the strange happiness the afternoon had left behind. Her name is Margaret, that is all I know for certain, though I suspect there is a great deal more to her than she has told me. A great deal more how? I am not entirely sure, Eleanor admitted, hanging her cloak by the door. But the house, Lucy. You should have seen it. Portraits stretching back generations, marble floors, a household staff large enough to run a small village. Whoever Margaret is, she is not simply a widow living quietly on modest means. Lucy's eyes widened. Then who is she? I do not know, Eleanor said again, though the words felt less certain each time she spoke them. But she has asked me to return, and I find that I want to. There is something honest in the way she speaks, something I have not found in many drawing rooms this season. I do not think I am in any danger, Lucy, whatever the mystery is. You said the same thing about attending alone in the first place, Lucy pointed out, though her tone had softened from worry into something closer to fascination. Very well. I suppose I cannot argue with a woman who insists on defending elderly strangers and accepting mysterious invitations in the same fortnight. Just promise me you will tell me everything, the moment you learn her true name. I promise, Eleanor said, and meant it, though she could not have guessed, standing in the quiet warmth of her own front hall, just how much the answer would change when it finally came. She did not yet know how right she was. She did not know that within days she would return to that same townhouse and find, waiting alongside Margaret, a man whose cold eyes and guarded manner would challenge her in ways no assembly room insult ever had, or that the questions Margaret had asked so carefully that afternoon had been leading toward a purpose Eleanor could not yet begin to guess. For now, she only knew that she had been invited back and that she intended to go. The door to the sitting room opened before Eleanor had even finished removing her gloves, and the man who stepped through it filled the space with a coldness that had nothing to do with the weather outside. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, dressed in a dark coat that fit him with the precision only the finest tailors achieved. His hair was dark, his jaw sharp, and his eyes, when they fell on Eleanor, held none of the warmth Margaret's had shown at their first meeting. They were guarded, assessing, and faintly, unmistakably suspicious. Eleanor had met men of rank before, at assemblies and dinners and the occasional card party her father still insisted on attending despite their reduced circumstances. Most of them wore their status like a comfortable coat, easy and careless, certain of their place in every room they entered. This man wore his differently, as though it were a weight rather than a privilege, something he carried with vigilance rather than pride. She sensed it immediately, before he had spoken a single word beyond his mother's name, and found herself both wary and unexpectedly curious. "Mother," he said without looking away from Eleanor, "you did not mention we were expecting company." "Mother." Eleanor's breath caught. She glanced quickly at Margaret, who sat serenely by the window as though nothing unusual had occurred, and felt the full weight of the townhouse's grandeur settle over her at last. Margaret was no ordinary widow. Margaret was someone's mother, and the man standing before her, cold-eyed and clearly displeased, was her son. "Sebastian," Margaret said calmly, "this is Miss Eleanor Whitfield. Miss Whitfield, my son." Sebastian's gaze did not soften. If anything, it sharpened further, moving over Eleanor with an assessment so thorough it made her want to straighten her spine and meet it head-on rather than shrink beneath it. "Miss Whitfield," he said, his tone polite but edged with something colder beneath. "Forgive my surprise. My mother does not often entertain new acquaintances, and rarely without informing me first. I did not realize informing you was a requirement of your mother's friendships," Eleanor said, before she could stop herself. A flicker of something crossed his face, too quick to name, surprise perhaps, or irritation, or both at once. "It is not a requirement," he said. "It is a precaution. My mother is a trusting woman, Miss Whitfield, and trusting women in her position tend to attract a particular kind of attention. I am sure you understand." Eleanor understood perfectly well what he was implying, and the accusation, however carefully wrapped in polite words, struck a nerve she had not expected to be so raw. "If you mean to suggest that I have sought your mother's company for some advantage, Your Grace, you may set your mind at ease. I did not know her name, her family, or her fortune until this very moment. I met her at an assembly, where she was being mocked by a group of thoughtless young women, and I said what needed saying. That is the whole of it. Your Grace." The title left her mouth before she had fully processed its weight, and she saw the confirmation in Margaret's small, knowing smile. Not a lord then, but a duke. The revelation settled over her like cold water, and for a moment her confidence wavered. But only for a moment. Sebastian's expression shifted again, something almost like reluctant respect passing briefly through his guarded eyes before the coolness returned. "You defended my mother without knowing who she was." "I would have defended her regardless," Eleanor said. "Kindness should not depend on rank, Your Grace. If anything, I would have been just as quick to speak up for a woman with no title at all, and rather less inclined to bow and scrape simply because a duchess happened to be present." "Dowager Duchess," Margaret corrected gently, clearly enjoying the exchange far more than either of the two people arguing in front of her. "Sebastian's father passed some years ago. My son inherited the title young, and has spent every year since guarding this family rather too closely for his own comfort, or mine. With good reason," Sebastian said, a note of tension entering his voice for the first time. "This family has been the target of more schemes and false friendships than I care to count, Mother. Forgive me if I am cautious when a stranger appears in your life so suddenly." He turned to Eleanor then, and though his tone remained even, there was a weariness beneath it that suggested old wounds rather than idle suspicion. You must understand, Miss Whitfield, that since my father's passing, this family has attracted a great deal of unwanted attention. Distant relations who suddenly remember our existence when they require funds. Acquaintances who appear devoted until the moment they require a favor. I have learned, through hard experience, that kindness is not always what it appears to be, and that the people most eager to gain my mother's trust are often the ones least deserving of it. That sounds like a lonely way to live, Eleanor said quietly, before she could stop herself. Something flickered across his face again, quick and unguarded before he could smooth it away. It is the way that keeps this family safe, he said. Loneliness is a small price, compared to the alternative. Eleanor is not a stranger, Margaret said. She is the young woman who stood up for me when no one else in that assembly room thought to. I would think you, of all people, might appreciate such courage rather than suspect it. Sebastian's jaw tightened, and for a moment Eleanor saw something beneath the coldness, a flash of genuine worry rather than mere suspicion. Whatever guarded him so fiercely was not born of arrogance alone. There was fear beneath it, old and deeply rooted, the kind that came from having been burned before. I appreciate courage, Sebastian said finally, his voice quieter now. I am simply less inclined than my mother to assume the best of every new acquaintance who appears in our lives without warning. He glanced briefly toward the portrait gallery beyond the sitting room doors, the same row of paintings Eleanor had passed on her way in, and something shadowed crossed his features. My father trusted easily, he said, almost to himself. It cost this family a great deal, in ways I do not care to discuss with someone I have known for the space of a single conversation. I hope you will forgive me if the habit of caution runs deeper in me than good manners would prefer. Eleanor said nothing for a moment, sensing that whatever lay behind his words was not hers to press for. I will not ask you to explain what you are not ready to share, Your Grace, she said finally. But I hope, in time, you will find that not everyone who walks through your door means to take something from you. Then perhaps, Eleanor said, meeting his gaze steadily, you might allow me the chance to prove myself, rather than condemning me before I have had the opportunity to disappoint you. It seems a fairer arrangement than judging me on suspicion alone. Something in her tone, or perhaps in the steadiness of her gaze, seemed to catch him off guard. He studied her for a long moment, longer than strict politeness required, as though reassessing an opinion he had already half formed. Very well, Miss Whitfield, he said at last. I will allow you that chance, though I hope you will forgive me if I remain watchful in the meantime. I would expect nothing less from a man so devoted to his mother's welfare, Eleanor said, and this time there was no bite in her words, only a genuine, if grudging, respect. Whatever else he was, cold and guarded and quick to suspect, he clearly loved his mother fiercely, and Eleanor found she could not fault him for that, however uncomfortable his scrutiny made her feel. Margaret, watching the exchange with poorly concealed delight, rose from her chair and gestured toward the tea service that had been laid out fresh for the occasion. Well, now that the introductions have been made in such a lively fashion, shall we sit? I find myself quite looking forward to seeing how the two of you manage a simple conversation over tea, given how thoroughly you have already managed to disagree without one. Sebastian's mouth twitched, the barest suggestion of amusement breaking through his guarded expression, though he quickly smoothed it away. He took the seat across from Eleanor, close enough that she could feel the weight of his continued attention even as Margaret steered the conversation toward safer topics, the weather, the upcoming season, a charity concert Margaret intended to attend the following week. Eleanor answered where required, polite and measured, but she remained acutely aware of Sebastian's presence beside her. The way his sharp eyes tracked every word she spoke, as though searching for the crack in her honesty he seemed certain must exist somewhere beneath the surface. She found, to her own surprise, that she did not entirely mind the scrutiny. There was something almost invigorating in being studied so closely, in knowing that whatever impression she left, it would not be an easy or a careless one. At one point, Margaret mentioned a charity concert planned for the following week, and asked whether Eleanor might consider attending. Eleanor hesitated, aware of the cost such an outing would represent for her family, however small the expense might seem within these walls, and Sebastian, watching her hesitation with unusual attentiveness, spoke before she could answer. The tickets are already accounted for, Mother. If Miss Whitfield agrees to come, it would hardly be a burden. Eleanor glanced at him, surprised by the offer, and faintly suspicious of the ease with which he had made it. That is generous, Your Grace, though I would not wish to impose. It is not an imposition, he said. It is simply practical. My mother enjoys your company, and I confess I would not mind the opportunity to observe you a little longer before forming my final judgment. How flattering. Eleanor said dryly. To be invited somewhere purely so that I might be judged more thoroughly. I did not say it was flattering, Sebastian replied, though the corner of his mouth twitched again. That same reluctant almost smile she had noticed earlier. I said it was practical. Margaret laughed softly at the exchange, clearly delighted by the sparring between them, and Eleanor felt her own irritation soften into something closer to amusement despite herself. There was an odd comfort in matching wits with a man who did not soften his words for her benefit, who spoke to her as plainly as she spoke to others, even if his plainness came wrapped in suspicion rather than warmth. You mentioned an assembly, Sebastian said, breaking into a lull in the conversation. Which one, precisely? The Ashford Assembly, Eleanor said. 3 weeks passed. I recall my mother mentioning she wished to attend, though I did not know she had gone through with it, Sebastian said, glancing toward Margaret with a faint furrow in his brow. You did not tell me you went alone. I did not go entirely alone, Margaret said mildly. James accompanied me, as always. James accompanied your carriage, Sebastian said. That is not the same as being watched over inside a crowded room full of strangers. Sebastian, Margaret said, her tone gently chiding. I am neither so fragile nor so foolish as you seem determined to believe. I have managed a great many rooms full of strangers in my life, long before you were born to worry over me. And yet you were mocked, and might have fallen had Miss Whitfield not intervened, Sebastian said, and Eleanor heard, beneath the sharpness of his words, something that sounded almost like fear, disguised as frustration. I did not fall, Margaret said. I stumbled, briefly, and Miss Whitfield was kind enough to offer her arm before anyone else thought to. That is the whole of what happened, and I do not intend to relive it as though it were some great catastrophe. Sebastian fell silent, though the tension in his shoulders did not fully ease, and Eleanor understood, watching him, that his coldness toward her was not truly about her at all. It was about every fear he carried for his mother's safety, every worry that came with a title too heavy for comfort, and a family history that had apparently taught him not to trust easily. I did not intend to cause you concern, Your Grace, Eleanor said quietly, when Margaret excused herself briefly to speak with the housekeeper. I only wished to see your mother treated with the respect she deserved. Sebastian regarded her for a long moment, the coldness in his expression finally giving way to something more thoughtful. I believe you, Miss Whitfield. That is, perhaps, what unsettles me most. I have grown accustomed to disbelieving people's intentions until proven otherwise. You are making that rather more difficult than I expected. Is that a compliment, Your Grace? It is an observation, he said, though the faintest curve touched the corner of his mouth. I have not yet decided whether it troubles me or not. Eleanor found herself smiling despite the strangeness of the entire afternoon, despite the cold reception and the guarded questions, and the sudden dizzying knowledge that she had somehow found herself seated across from a duke who watched her as though trying to solve a puzzle he had not expected to encounter. There was something honest in his suspicion, she realized, something that spoke of loyalty rather than cruelty, and she found that quality, however inconvenient in the moment, difficult to entirely dislike. When Margaret returned, the conversation moved on to lighter matters, but Eleanor remained aware, for the rest of the visit, of Sebastian's watchful gaze resting on her more often than strict politeness required, and of her own growing curiosity about the guarded man who clearly loved his mother more fiercely than his cold manners let on. As the afternoon drew to its close and Eleanor rose to take her leave, Sebastian insisted, somewhat stiffly, on seeing her to the door himself, rather than leaving the task to a footman. They walked together through the marble hallway in a silence that felt less uncomfortable than it had any right to be, given how their conversation had begun. I hope I have not offended you today, Miss Whitfield, he said finally as they reached the entrance. My manner is not always what it should be, particularly where my mother is concerned. You have not offended me, Your Grace, Eleanor said. Suspicion born of love is easier to forgive than suspicion born of arrogance. I think you will find, in time, that I have no hidden design beyond enjoying your mother's company. But I understand why you must be careful. I would rather earn your trust honestly than have it given freely and undeserved. He studied her for a long moment at the threshold, the evening light catching the sharp planes of his face, softening them slightly. That, he said quietly, is precisely the kind of answer that makes me trust you a little more than I intended to this afternoon. Eleanor left the townhouse with her pulse beating a touch faster than the walk home could explain, and the distinct, unsettling awareness that the guarded Duke of Ashcombe had occupied far more of her thoughts during the visit than she had expected, or entirely wished for. She told herself it was merely curiosity, the natural interest one felt toward an unusual and complicated character. She did not yet allow herself to consider that it might be anything more, though some quiet part of her, walking home beneath the darkening London sky, already suspected the truth. The invitation to the charity concert arrived 2 days later, sealed this time with a proper crest, a coiled serpent beneath a crown, the mark of the Ashcombe dukedom. Eleanor stared at it for a long moment before showing it to her father, who nearly dropped his teacup when he read the name beneath the seal. "The Duke of Ashcombe," he said, his voice unsteady. "Eleanor, do you have any notion what family you have found yourself entangled with?" "None at all. Until 3 days ago," Eleanor admitted. "I only knew her as Margaret." Her father set the letter down carefully, as though it might shatter. "Margaret Ashcombe is one of the most respected women in London, and has been for 30 years. Her late husband was close with the king himself before his passing. Her son, the current duke, is said to be one of the wealthiest men in England, and among the most difficult to approach. He has refused every match his relations have proposed since inheriting the title, and society has all but given up hope of seeing him married." Eleanor absorbed this information slowly, feeling the full weight of it settle over her like a heavy cloak. She thought of Sebastian's guarded eyes, his careful questions, the shadow that had crossed his face when he mentioned his father's misplaced trust, and understood, with sudden clarity, exactly how much caution shaped every part of his life. "I do not think he means to marry anyone, least of all someone in my circumstances," she said. "He suspects everyone of scheming, Papa. I doubt he trusts anyone enough to consider marriage at all." "Then be careful, my dear," her father said gently. "Families such as this one do not welcome outsiders easily, however kind the Dowager Duchess may be to you personally. If word spreads that you have caught the Duke's attention, you may find yourself facing more scrutiny than you bargained for." Eleanor thought of Charlotte Price's narrowed eyes at the assembly, and felt a small chill settle over her father's warning. She had already made one enemy in London society without trying. She did not particularly wish to discover how many more a connection to the Ashcombe family might invite. "I do not seek his attention, Papa," she said. "I only wish to keep Margaret's friendship. She has been kind to me in ways I did not expect, and I would not give that up simply because society enjoys inventing scandal where none exists." "I do not doubt your intentions, my dear," her father said, folding the letter carefully and handing it back to her. "It is the intentions of others I worry over. A young woman without fortune, drawn suddenly into the company of the wealthiest family in London, makes an easy target for gossip, however innocent the friendship truly is. Guard yourself accordingly." Eleanor promised she would, though she privately suspected that guarding herself against gossip and guarding herself against the growing warmth she felt toward Sebastian's careful, guarded company were two very different tasks, and she was not yet certain she could manage either one successfully. But when the evening of the concert arrived, and she stepped into the grand hall on Margaret's arm, with Sebastian walking a careful pace behind them, she found it difficult to remain cautious for long. The hall itself was breathtaking, tall columns wrapped in candlelight, high windows reflecting the glow of 100 small flames, and a crowd of London's finest families dressed in silks and jewels that caught the light with every small movement. The music was beautiful, a string quartet playing something achingly tender, and Margaret's company was warm and easy, in a way that made the surrounding grandeur feel almost comfortable rather than intimidating. Eleanor felt eyes upon her almost immediately, curious glances from strangers who clearly recognized the Dowager Duchess and wondered at the unfamiliar young woman on her arm. She held her chin steady beneath the attention, reminding herself that she had faced worse scrutiny at the assembly, and survived it without flinching. Sebastian, for his part, seemed to have softened slightly since their first meeting, though his guarded manner had not disappeared entirely. He offered Eleanor his arm as they moved through the crowded hall, and though his expression remained carefully composed, she noticed him watching the room with the same vigilance he had shown at the townhouse, tracking every face that turned in their direction, every whisper exchanged behind gloved hands. "You are still watching for danger," Eleanor observed quietly, as Margaret paused to greet an old friend nearby. "I am always watching for danger," Sebastian admitted. "It has become something of a habit. Even here, surrounded by musicians and charitable donors?" "Especially here," he said. "Rooms full of wealth and reputation are precisely where the most dangerous schemes take root, Miss Whitfield. You would be surprised how much cruelty hides behind a well-cut coat and a polite smile." Eleanor considered this, watching the elegant crowd move around them, each face composed into practiced pleasantness. "That sounds like a difficult way to enjoy an evening of music." "It is," he admitted, something almost rueful entering his voice, "though I find, tonight, that I am enjoying it rather more than I expected to." The admission hung between them, quiet but unmistakable, and Eleanor felt an unfamiliar warmth rise in her chest at the words, at the reluctant honesty behind them. She glanced up at him and found his gaze already resting on her, steady and unguarded in a way she had not yet seen from him. "I am glad, Your Grace," she said softly. "Sebastian," he said, "if we are to continue meeting so frequently, I think we might dispense with the title, at least in private conversation." "Sebastian, then," Eleanor said, testing the name and finding she liked the shape of it more than she expected to. Their conversation was interrupted by the return of Margaret, who took in the easy proximity between them with a small, satisfied smile she did not bother to hide. "I see the two of you have found something to discuss in my absence." "Only the music, Mother," Sebastian said, a touch too quickly, and Eleanor bit back a smile at the faint color rising in his usually composed face. "Of course," Margaret said, clearly unconvinced but wise enough not to press further. "Well, the second half is about to begin. Shall we find our seats?" They settled into a private box overlooking the stage, Margaret between them at first, though as the evening wore on and the music swelled, she quietly excused herself to speak with another old acquaintance in the box beside theirs, leaving Eleanor and Sebastian alone in the dim, candlelit space. Neither spoke for a while, content to listen to the music, but Eleanor was acutely aware of Sebastian's presence beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him even without touching, close enough that every small movement between them felt weighted with something neither had named aloud. Below them, the quartet moved into a slower piece, the melody rising and falling with quiet grace, and Eleanor found herself glancing sideways at Sebastian more than the music alone could explain. In the candlelight, his usual guardedness had softened into something gentler, his sharp features less severe, his dark eyes fixed on the stage below with an ease she had not seen from him before. She wondered, watching him, how rarely he allowed himself moments like this one, how much of his life had been spent standing watch rather than simply existing within a room. "May I ask you something?" Sebastian said finally, during a quiet passage in the music. "Of course. Why did you truly help my mother that night? I have turned the question over many times since we met, and I confess, I have not settled on an answer that fully satisfies me." Eleanor considered the question carefully before answering. "I suppose I could not stand to watch someone be humiliated for no reason beyond cruelty. It has always been that way with me. I see an injustice, and something in me simply cannot look away, whatever the cost to myself. My mother used to say it would get me into trouble one day. And has it?" "More often than I would like to admit," Eleanor said, smiling faintly, "though I find I would not trade the habit away, even if I could. It feels dishonest to stay silent when speaking the truth costs so little compared to the harm silence allows." Sebastian was quiet for a long moment, studying her profile in the dim light. "My father was similar, in his own way," he said finally, "though his trust was less discerning than yours seems to be. He believed the best of everyone, even those who did not deserve it, and it left this family vulnerable in ways I have spent years trying to repair." "What happened to him, if you do not mind my asking?" Sebastian's jaw tightened briefly before he answered. "A business partner he trusted for 20 years persuaded him to invest heavily in a venture that never truly existed. By the time the truth came out, the man had vanished, with a considerable portion of the family's fortune, and my father, already unwell, never fully recovered from the shame of it. He passed less than a year later, and I inherited a title, a fortune reduced by nearly a third, and a lesson I have never forgotten since." "I am sorry," Eleanor said gently. "That must have been difficult, watching someone you loved be taken advantage of." "It was," Sebastian said, "and it taught me to guard what remains of this family very carefully. I do not regret the caution, even when it makes me difficult company." He paused, then added quieter, "Though I confess, this evening, I have found myself wishing I could set a little of that caution aside." Eleanor turned to look at him fully, surprised by the vulnerability in his admission. "Why tonight, of all evenings?" "Because," Sebastian said, his voice low, "I find that the more time I spend in your company, the less convinced I am that you require guarding against at all." The music swelled around them, filling the silence that followed his words, and Eleanor felt something shift quietly between them, a fragile, unspoken understanding neither was quite ready to name. She did not answer immediately, uncertain what words could possibly match the weight of the moment, but she allowed her hand to rest, briefly, lightly, against his on the velvet armrest between them, and felt him go still beside her, as though the small gesture had struck him more deeply than any words could have. Neither of them noticed, in that quiet moment, the sharp, calculating gaze watching them from the box across the hall, where a distant cousin of the Ashcombe family sat observing the closeness between the Duke and the unknown young woman at his side with an expression that held nothing warm in it at all. Edmund Caro had heard whispers already of the mysterious Miss Whitfield who had captured the Dowager Duchess's affection, and watching Sebastian lean toward her now, guarded no longer, he began, quietly and carefully, to consider how such an unexpected attachment might be turned to his own advantage. Edmund had spent years cultivating patience where the Ashcombe fortune was concerned, waiting for some crack to appear in Sebastian's careful defenses, some opportunity to insert himself back into the family's good graces after years of cool distance following a dispute over inheritance that had never fully healed. He had assumed, until tonight, that Sebastian's guarded heart would remain closed indefinitely, safely beyond the reach of any woman clever enough to attempt it. Watching the unmistakable softness in the Duke's expression now, he reconsidered. A guarded heart, once opened, could be a vulnerability as easily as a strength, if the right pressure were applied in the right place, at the right time. He said nothing to the acquaintances seated beside him, offering only a polite smile when the music ended, and the hall rose in scattered applause. But his mind was already turning over possibilities, weighing the unknown Miss Whitfield's modest circumstances against the considerable prize she appeared, quite unexpectedly, to be winning, and wondering how easily a story might be shaped to turn her sudden good fortune into her undoing instead. The whispers began before Eleanor even stepped through the garden gate, and by the time she reached the lawn where the party had gathered beneath striped canopies and blooming roses, she could feel them pressing against her like a physical weight. "There she is," someone murmured nearby, not troubling to lower her voice enough. "The fortune hunter who has wormed her way into the Dowager Duchess's affections." Eleanor's steps faltered, though she forced herself to keep walking, her chin lifted despite the sudden heat rising in her cheeks. She had grown used to gossip in the weeks since the assembly, but this felt different, sharper, more deliberate, as though someone had taken care to shape the whispers into something far crueler than idle curiosity. The garden itself seemed almost mocking in its beauty, roses climbing white trellises in full summer bloom, the afternoon sun warm and golden across the lawn, musicians tuning their instruments beneath a canopy of silk. It was exactly the kind of gathering Eleanor had once dreamed of attending, back when her family's fortunes had still seemed capable of recovery, and now, walking through it beneath a cloud of whispered accusation, she felt the bitter irony of finally belonging in such a place only to be told, loudly and cruelly, that she did not belong at all. She found Lucy near the refreshment table, her friend's expression already tight with concern. "Eleanor, thank goodness. You need to hear what is being said before you encounter it unprepared." "I have already heard some of it," Eleanor said quietly. "Fortune hunter. Is that the kindest phrase circulating, or merely the one I was meant to overhear?" "There is worse," Lucy admitted reluctantly. "Someone has been telling anyone who will listen that you deliberately staged the encounter at the assembly, that you knew exactly who Margaret was and engineered the entire meeting to secure an introduction to her son. They are saying you have been maneuvering your way into the family's good graces ever since, hoping to trap the Duke into marriage before anyone can warn him of your true intentions." Eleanor felt the accusation land like a blow, all the more painful for how thoroughly it twisted the truth into something unrecognizable. "That is absurd. I did not even know Margaret's name until our second meeting, let alone that she was connected to a duke." "I know that," Lucy said. "But the story is spreading regardless, and it is spreading with details that suggest whoever started it knows a great deal about your circumstances. Your father's debts, your brother's school fees, things a stranger inventing gossip from nothing would not easily know." A cold unease settled in Eleanor's stomach. Someone close to the family then, or close enough to have learned such details deliberately. She thought immediately of Edmund Caro, the cousin she had been briefly introduced to at the concert, whose polite smile had never quite reached his calculating eyes. She did not have long to wonder. Across the garden she spotted Charlotte Price, standing at the center of a small, attentive circle, her voice carrying just far enough to ensure her words reached beyond her immediate audience. "I heard she practically threw herself at the old woman that night," Charlotte was saying, knowing full well who she was. "Some women will do anything to climb above their station, however desperate the performance appears to those with eyes to see it." Eleanor's hands curled into fists at her sides, the old assembly room anger rising hot and immediate. But before she could cross the lawn to answer the accusation directly, a familiar voice cut through the murmuring crowd with unmistakable authority. "I would be careful, Miss Price, about repeating stories you cannot substantiate." Margaret had arrived, moving through the garden with a straight-backed dignity that silenced conversation wherever she passed. Charlotte's face drained of color as the Dowager Duchess approached, the confident sneer vanishing instantly beneath a scramble of nervous deference. "Your Grace, I did not mean—" "You meant precisely what you said," Or you would not have said it so loudly. In a garden full of witnesses, Margaret said, her voice cool and cutting, in a way Eleanor had not yet heard from her. Miss Whitfield did not know my name when she defended me at that assembly. She could not have known, because I told no one my true identity that evening, deliberately, for reasons that are entirely my own affair. If you have questions about how our friendship began, Miss Price, I suggest you ask me directly, rather than inventing a more convenient story to entertain your friends. The garden had gone utterly silent, every eye now fixed on the confrontation unfolding beneath the striped canopy. Charlotte's mouth opened and closed without producing any sound, clearly unprepared to argue with a dowager duchess in front of half of fashionable London. I only repeated what I had heard, Your Grace, Charlotte finally managed. I did not mean to cause offense. You meant precisely to cause offense, Margaret said. You simply did not expect to be caught doing so in my presence. I would advise you to consider, in future, whether the stories you choose to spread are worth the cost to your own reputation, when the truth eventually comes to light. And it always does, Miss Price. Truth has a stubborn way of surfacing, however carefully one tries to bury it. Charlotte withdrew hastily, her earlier confidence replaced by visible mortification, and the small crowd around her dispersed just as quickly, suddenly finding urgent reasons to be elsewhere. Margaret turned to Eleanor, her expression softening from cool authority into genuine warmth. Are you well, my dear? I came as soon as I heard what was being said. I am well enough, Eleanor said, though her voice trembled slightly with the aftermath of anger and relief mingled together. Though I confess I do not understand how the story spread so quickly, or how whoever began it knew such particular details about my family. That, Margaret said grimly, is precisely what concerns me as well. They did not have long to wonder. Sebastian arrived moments later, his expression thunderous as he crossed the lawn toward them, having clearly heard some version of the rumor already circulating through the garden. Is it true? He demanded, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. Someone has been telling half of London that you engineered your friendship with my mother for personal gain. It is not true, Eleanor said steadily, meeting his gaze without flinching, though her heart clenched at the sight of his obvious anger. I would not blame you for wondering, given how quickly and thoroughly the story has spread. But I did not know your mother's identity until she chose to reveal it herself. I have gained nothing from this friendship beyond her company, which I value for its own sake, and nothing more. Sebastian studied her for a long moment, and Eleanor braced herself for the suspicion she had first encountered in his sitting room weeks earlier, the cold, guarded assessment that had once made her doubt whether he could ever trust her fully. But instead, something in his expression shifted, hardened not against her but on her behalf. I do not doubt you, he said finally, quiet but firm. I have watched you closely enough these past weeks to know precisely the sort of person you are, Miss Whitfield, and it is not the person these rumors describe. Relief washed through Eleanor so suddenly it nearly unsteadied her. Thank you, she said softly. You cannot know how much that means to me. Then allow me to demonstrate it further, Sebastian said, and before Eleanor could ask what he meant, he turned to address the garden at large, his voice carrying with the same natural authority his mother had shown moments earlier. I understand there has been a great deal of speculation this afternoon regarding Miss Whitfield's character and her friendship with my family, he said, loud enough that every remaining guest turned to listen. I will say this once, plainly, so that there can be no further confusion on the matter. Miss Whitfield defended my mother from cruelty she did not deserve, without any knowledge of who my mother was or what family she belonged to. She has shown nothing but honesty and kindness in every interaction since, and I trust her judgment and her character completely. Anyone who continues to spread stories suggesting otherwise will find themselves answering directly to me. A murmur moved through the garden, equal parts shock and fascination, and Eleanor felt her cheeks warm under the sudden weight of every gaze turning toward her, though this time the attention felt entirely different than Charlotte's cruel whispers had, warmed instead by Sebastian's public and unmistakable declaration of trust. You did not need to do that, Eleanor said quietly, once the crowd's attention had begun to disperse back into scattered conversation. I wanted to, Sebastian said. I have spent years guarding this family against false friendships and empty flattery, Miss Whitfield. I recognize honesty when I encounter it, and I will not stand by while it is punished as though it were deceit. Margaret, watching the exchange with quiet satisfaction, excused herself to speak with a nearby acquaintance, leaving Eleanor and Sebastian standing together beneath the roses, the garden's earlier tension slowly easing around them. I still do not understand who began the story, Eleanor said, her mind returning to the unsettling precision of the details that had circulated. Someone knew things about my family that no idle gossip could easily invent. Sebastian's expression darkened again, though this time his anger seemed directed elsewhere. I have my suspicions, he said. There are those in my extended family who have long resented the distance I have kept from them, and who might see an advantage in discrediting anyone who threatens to grow close to my mother, or to me. Edmund Caro, Eleanor said, the name surfacing from memory before she fully decided to speak it. Sebastian's sharp glance told her she had guessed correctly. You are perceptive, Miss Whitfield. I have not confirmed it, but I intend to. Edmund has wanted access to this family's fortune for years, and has been rebuffed at every attempt. A scandal that removed you from my mother's affections and perhaps damaged my own reputation in the process would suit his purposes rather well. Eleanor felt a chill at the thought of a stranger's careful scheming reaching so deliberately into her family's private circumstances, but beneath the unease, she felt something steadier too, a quiet gratitude for the two people standing beside her now, unwavering in their defense of her character, when it would have been far easier to simply let the rumors run their course. Whatever comes of it, she said, I am glad to have you both in my corner. Always, Sebastian said, and the quiet certainty in his voice settled something unspoken between them, a promise neither had fully voiced but both had clearly begun to feel, growing steadily beneath every guarded glance and honest conversation they had shared since the night of the assembly. Weeks that felt, now, like the opening pages of a story neither of them had expected to find themselves living. Edmund Caro arrived at the garden party late, timing his entrance carefully to avoid the earlier confrontation, and by the time he strolled beneath the striped canopy with a glass of wine in hand, the worst of the gossip had already begun to curdle against him rather than Eleanor. He noticed the change in the air immediately, the way conversations quieted rather than brightened as he passed, and understood, with a flicker of unease, that his careful scheme had not unfolded quite as smoothly as he had planned. He found Sebastian standing near the edge of the garden, speaking quietly with Eleanor, and approached with a smile that did not reach his eyes. Cousin, Edmund said smoothly, I hear there has been quite a commotion this afternoon. I do hope Miss Whitfield has not been too troubled by whatever nonsense has been circulating. You hear correctly, Sebastian said, his tone flat and unwelcoming. Though I confess I am curious how you came to hear of it so quickly, Edmund, given that you have only just arrived. Something flickered behind Edmund's practiced smile, gone almost before Eleanor could be certain she had seen it. Servants talk, cousin. News travels quickly in circles such as ours. It does, Sebastian agreed evenly, particularly when someone takes care to ensure it travels in a particular direction, toward a particular conclusion. Edmund's smile tightened, though he recovered his composure quickly. I am not certain what you mean to imply. I think you understand precisely what I mean to imply, Sebastian said, stepping closer, his voice low but edged with unmistakable warning. I do not have proof yet, Edmund, but I intend to find it, and when I do, I will not extend to you the courtesy of a quiet conversation in a garden. Consider this your only warning. Edmund's gaze flicked briefly to Eleanor, calculating and cold despite his practiced pleasantness, before he inclined his head stiffly and excused himself, retreating toward the far end of the garden without another word. Eleanor watched him go, an uneasy chill settling over her despite the warmth of the afternoon sun. Do you truly believe he will stop, now that he has been warned? She asked quietly. No, Sebastian admitted. Men like Edmund rarely abandon a scheme simply because they have been caught considering it. If anything, being exposed only makes them more careful, and more dangerous. The second time, I intend to watch him closely from now on, and I would ask that you do the same, should he attempt to approach you directly. I will, Eleanor promised, though the uneasy feeling lingered, a quiet reminder that whatever peace the afternoon's confrontation had won her, the danger had not yet fully passed. The letter that finally exposed Edmund Caro arrived at the townhouse 3 weeks after the garden party, delivered by a nervous young clerk who insisted on speaking with Sebastian directly, rather than leaving the matter with a footman. Eleanor was present when it happened, seated with Margaret in the same sunlit sitting room where she had first learned the truth of Margaret's identity, when Sebastian entered with the letter still open in his hand, his expression a mixture of grim satisfaction and lingering anger. It is done, he said. The clerk works for the solicitor Edmund hired to draft false correspondence. Correspondence meant to look as though it came from your father's creditors, Miss Whitfield, suggesting your family's debts were considerably worse than they truly are, and that you had agreed to certain arrangements regarding repayment that would have painted you as desperate and calculating to anyone who read them. Eleanor felt a cold wave of understanding wash over her. That is where the details came from. The debts, my brother's school fees. He fabricated evidence to support the rumors he was already spreading. Precisely, Sebastian said. The clerk grew uneasy about the scheme once he realized its true purpose, and came to me rather than complete the forgery. Edmund's plan was more elaborate than mere gossip, Miss Whitfield. He intended to present the false correspondence to my mother directly, timed to arrive just as public opinion had turned fully against you, hoping the combination would be enough to convince her to end the friendship herself, out of concern for the family's reputation. Margaret's expression had gone hard with fury Eleanor had not yet seen from her. He would have used forged documents against an innocent young woman, all to satisfy his own greed. I confess I did not think even Edmund capable of such deliberate cruelty. I did, Sebastian said grimly, which is precisely why I have already sent word to the family solicitor, and to 2 witnesses among our acquaintance who will confirm the forgery's origin. Edmund will not escape the consequences of this scheme. I intend to see him formally disgraced before the season ends, and barred from any further contact with his family or its fortune. Eleanor felt a complicated mixture of relief and lingering unease at the news, the danger finally resolving into something she could understand and address, rather than the vague, threatening uncertainty that had shadowed the weeks since the garden party. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Both of you. I do not know how I would have managed these past weeks without your support." "You would have managed," Margaret said gently. "You are considerably stronger than you give yourself credit for, my dear. But I am glad you did not have to manage alone." Sebastian set the letter aside and moved to sit beside Eleanor, closer than strict propriety typically allowed, though neither Margaret nor Eleanor seemed inclined to remark upon it. "There is something else I wish to discuss," he said, "though perhaps not today, with Edmund's scheme still fresh in all our minds." "You may ask me anything, Sebastian," Eleanor said. "I think we have moved well beyond the need for careful timing between us." He studied her for a long moment, something vulnerable moving beneath his usual composure. "Very well. I have spent these past weeks watching you weather cruelty and suspicion, with a grace I do not think I could have managed in your position, and I find, at the end of it, that I am no longer merely curious about your character, Miss Whitfield. I find that I have come to care for you a great deal more deeply than caution would advise." Eleanor's breath caught, her heart racing at words she had hoped for without allowing herself to fully expect them. "Sebastian, let me finish," he said gently. "I have spent years guarding this family against false friendship, so thoroughly that I nearly failed to recognize true friendship when it finally appeared before me, dressed in a modest gown and armed with more honesty than half of London combined. I do not offer my trust easily, Eleanor. I have not offered it fully to anyone beyond my mother since my father's death. But I offer it to you now, completely, and I find that I wish for a great deal more than friendship in return, if you are willing to consider it." Margaret, watching the exchange with tears gathering unashamedly in her sharp gray eyes, rose quietly and excused herself from the room, leaving the 2 of them alone in the golden afternoon light. "I have cared for you for weeks longer than I have been willing to admit, even to myself," Eleanor said softly, once Margaret's footsteps had faded down the hallway. "I told myself it was merely curiosity, or gratitude, or simple friendship, but I do not think any of those explanations were ever entirely true." "Then may I call on your father this week?" Sebastian asked, a rare, unguarded smile breaking fully across his face for the first time since Eleanor had known him. "I find I am no longer content to wait patiently for whatever caution suggests is wise." "You may," Eleanor said, laughing through sudden, unexpected tears of her own, "though I suspect he will be considerably more shocked by your visit than I am by your question." Sebastian's visit to Eleanor's father the following week went considerably better than either of them anticipated, her father's initial shock giving way quickly to genuine warmth once he witnessed, over the course of a long afternoon conversation, the sincerity behind the Duke's guarded manner, and the obvious depth of his regard for Eleanor's character rather than her circumstances. "You understand," her father said carefully, partway through their conversation, "that my daughter brings no significant fortune to this match. Her dowry, such as it is, would barely cover the cost of a single evening's entertainment in your circles." "I am not seeking a fortune, sir," Sebastian said. "I have more wealth than this family could spend in 3 lifetimes. What I sought, without fully realizing it until recently, was honesty, and I have found more of it in your daughter than in every calculated match my relations have proposed since I inherited my title. I would consider it the great privilege of my life to make her my wife, dowry or no dowry." Her father studied him for a long moment, then extended his hand with evident relief and genuine warmth. "Then you have my blessing, your grace, and my gratitude besides. I confess I feared, given her strong will and sharper tongue, that my daughter might never find a man patient enough to match her. It seems I need not have worried." "Her strong will and sharp tongue," Sebastian said, smiling, "are precisely what I have come to love most about her." The formal proposal came 3 weeks later, at the very same assembly hall where Eleanor had first offended a stranger without knowing the consequences that single act of kindness would set into motion. Sebastian had arranged the evening carefully, ensuring the same crowd that had once watched Eleanor humiliate Charlotte Price in defense of an elderly woman would now witness something considerably more joyful. He found her near the same spot where they had first exchanged words weeks earlier, though this time surrounded by friends rather than mockery. Lucy standing close by with barely contained excitement, clearly having been informed in advance of what the evening held in store. "Miss Whitfield," Sebastian said, loudly enough that conversation around them began to quiet, the assembly room's attention turning once again toward the pair, though this time without a trace of cruelty in the watching eyes. "Some weeks ago, in this very room, you taught me something I had forgotten in the years since my father's passing. You taught me that kindness offered without expectation of reward remains one of the rarest and most valuable qualities a person can possess, and that trust, once earned honestly, is worth every risk required to offer it in return." Eleanor felt her heart pounding as the room's attention settled fully upon them, Sebastian dropping to one knee with a composure that only barely concealed the emotion beneath it. "I do not offer you a title, or a fortune, though both will certainly accompany this proposal," he said. "I offer you my complete trust, which I have not given freely to anyone beyond my mother in a great many years, and my whole heart, which you have somehow claimed without my full permission over these past several weeks. Eleanor Whitfield, will you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" The assembly room erupted into astonished murmurs, though beneath the surprise, Eleanor could hear genuine warmth in many of the voices. The same crowd that had once watched a stranger's cruelty, now witnessing something considerably more hopeful unfold before them. She found Margaret near the edge of the crowd, beaming with unabashed joy, and felt the full weight of everything the past months had brought her, the fear, and the danger, and the unexpected, growing warmth of a friendship that had blossomed into something far deeper than she had ever anticipated. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and steady despite the tears gathering in her eyes. "Yes, Sebastian, I will." The cheer that rose through the assembly room was genuine, warm, and entirely unlike the cold whispers that had once filled the same space. And as Sebastian rose to take her in his arms, Eleanor felt, for the first time since her mother's passing years earlier, the full and certain knowledge that she had finally found a place where she truly belonged, not because of her fortune or her family name, but because of the honest kindness she had offered a stranger without any expectation of return. Their wedding took place 2 months later, in a ceremony far grander than anything Eleanor's modest upbringing had prepared her to expect, yet made comfortable by the presence of those who had walked the difficult path beside her, Lucy standing as her closest attendant, Margaret beaming from the front pew with the particular pride of a mother who had watched her son find happiness she had feared he might never allow himself to seek. The chapel had been filled with white roses, echoing the garden where the worst of Edmund's scheme had once unfolded, though Eleanor found she did not mind the connection. It felt, in a strange way, like reclaiming something that cruelty had once tried to spoil, transforming the memory of that difficult afternoon into something entirely different, something worth celebrating rather than fearing. Her father walked her down the aisle with tears he made no effort to hide, and when Eleanor caught sight of Sebastian waiting at the altar, dressed in formal black, his usual guardedness replaced entirely by open, unmistakable joy, she felt any lingering doubt she might have carried dissolve completely. This was not a match born of scheming or convenience, whatever cruel rumors had once suggested. It was simply two people who had found, against every careful expectation either had carried into the encounter, a partnership built on honesty rather than calculation. Edmund Caro's disgrace had been finalized weeks before the wedding, his forgery scheme exposed thoroughly enough that he found himself barred not only from the Ashcombe family's presence but from most of London's respectable society as well. A fitting consequence for a man who had underestimated both the loyalty of the family he sought to exploit and the character of the young woman he had tried to destroy. As Eleanor stood beside Sebastian at the close of the ceremony, accepting the congratulations of a crowd that had once whispered cruelty about her name, she found herself thinking back to the trembling elderly woman she had defended at an assembly months earlier, without knowing her name, her fortune, or the extraordinary path that single act of kindness would eventually carve through her own life. She had not helped Margaret that night expecting anything in return. She had simply refused to stay silent while cruelty went unanswered, and in doing so had found not only a mother figure she had lost years too early, but a partner whose guarded heart had proven, in the end, worth every ounce of patience and honesty required to earn it fully. Kindness, she thought, watching Sebastian's face soften as he looked at her, truly was rarer than most people realized. But it was never wasted, however small the gesture, however uncertain the outcome. Sometimes, if a person was fortunate enough, it returned tenfold, in ways no one could have possibly predicted on an ordinary evening at an assembly, defending a stranger who would become, in time, the most beloved family Eleanor had ever known. Later that evening, as the wedding celebration wound down and the guests began to depart into the warm summer night, Margaret found a quiet moment alone with Eleanor near the edge of the garden. The same roses that had once witnessed cruelty now lit softly by lantern light. "I knew, that very first evening at the assembly, that there was something remarkable in you," Margaret said, taking Eleanor's hands in her own. "I did not expect it would lead quite this far, but I confess I am not entirely surprised. My son needed someone unafraid to challenge him, and you needed someone who would never ask you to soften the very qualities that make you who you are. I could not have chosen more carefully myself had I tried." "You did choose in a way," Eleanor said, smiling. "You could have thanked me quietly and disappeared into that carriage, and none of this would have happened." "Perhaps," Margaret said, her eyes bright with quiet affection. "But some things, my dear, feel less like choice, and more like fate simply waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. I am only glad I lived to see it." Eleanor embraced her warmly, feeling, in that quiet garden moment, the full and complete sense of belonging she had once feared she might never find, not through fortune or title, but through the simple, unshakable power of a single honest act, offered freely to a stranger who had turned out to be exactly the family she never knew she needed. A year into their marriage, a letter arrived at the Ashcombe estate that threatened to unravel the peace Eleanor and Sebastian had built together, and it came from a source neither of them expected. Life at the estate had settled, over the preceding months, into a rhythm Eleanor had once thought impossible for someone of her modest beginnings. She managed the household with the same steady competence she had once applied to her father's strained finances, only now with resources vast enough that the work felt less like survival, and more like genuine purpose. Sebastian had grown noticeably lighter since their wedding, his guarded watchfulness softened by a year of proof that trust, once given carefully, could hold. Margaret visited often, delighting in a grandchild she hoped would arrive before too many more seasons passed, and the estate itself had become, for Eleanor, the first true home she had known since her mother's passing. It was into this hard-won peace that the letter arrived. Eleanor was in the small study she had claimed as her own, reviewing household accounts with the same careful attention she had once given her father's struggling ledgers, when the housekeeper delivered a letter bearing a foreign postmark and an unfamiliar hand. Eleanor opened it, expecting some minor correspondence from a distant acquaintance, and felt her stomach drop as she read the first lines. The letter came from a solicitor in France, writing on behalf of a man claiming to be Edmund Caro's estranged half-brother, someone the family had never known existed. According to the letter, this half-brother possessed documents suggesting that certain portions of the Ashcombe fortune, inherited generations earlier, had been obtained through a disputed land claim that predated even Sebastian's grandfather, and he intended to bring the matter before the courts unless a substantial settlement was reached quietly and swiftly. Eleanor brought the letter to Sebastian immediately, finding him in his study reviewing correspondence of his own, and watched his expression darken as he read through the claims twice, his jaw tightening with the particular tension she had come to recognize whenever old family wounds resurfaced unexpectedly. "This is absurd," he said finally, setting the letter down with more force than necessary. The land in question was settled generations ago, with proper documentation filed and witnessed. Whoever this man is, he is either mistaken, or attempting the very same kind of scheme Edmund once tried against you. "Do you think they are connected?" Eleanor asked. "Edmund and this half-brother?" "I would not be surprised," Sebastian said grimly. "Edmund has had over a year to nurse his resentment since his disgrace. It would not shock me if he had reached out to distant relations, real or invented, hoping to find some new avenue of attack against this family." They spent the following weeks investigating the claim carefully, Sebastian corresponding with the family solicitor while Eleanor, drawing on skills she had honed managing her father's difficult finances years earlier, combed through generations of estate records searching for the original land documentation the letter had called into question. The estate archive occupied a long, dusty room on the ground floor that Eleanor had rarely visited before, shelves of leather-bound ledgers and yellowed deeds stretching back nearly a century, each one representing a piece of the family's long history. She spent entire afternoons there, sleeves rolled and hands stained with old ink, working her way methodically through decades of records, while Sebastian handled the more delicate matter of communicating with solicitors on both sides of the channel, careful not to concede a single point that might strengthen the false claim against them. "You do not have to spend your days buried in old paper," Sebastian told her one evening, finding her still bent over a ledger long after the household had retired for the night. I can hire a clerk to search the archives properly. A hired clerk does not know what he is truly searching for, Eleanor said, without looking up from the page in front of her. I know your family's history now nearly as well as my own, Sebastian. I would rather find the answer myself than wait anxiously for someone else to bring it to me. He watched her a moment longer, something warm and unmistakably proud settling into his expression, before he simply pulled up a second chair and began searching alongside her, the two of them working late into the night by candlelight, side by side, exactly as they had faced every difficulty since the day they met. It was Eleanor, in the end, who found the answer, buried in a dusty ledger from 3 generations past, a detailed record of the land purchase in question, complete with witness signatures and a formal deed that left no room for dispute. She brought the discovery to Sebastian late one evening, triumphant despite the exhaustion of weeks spent searching. Here, she said, spreading the old documents across his desk. The land was purchased outright, not seized or disputed as the letter claims. Your great-grandfather paid a fair price, witnessed by 2 magistrates whose signatures are still perfectly legible. Whoever is behind this claim, they either did not know this documentation existed, or they hoped no one would trouble themselves to look for it. Sebastian studied the documents carefully, relief slowly replacing the tension that had gathered in his shoulders over the preceding weeks. You have saved this family a great deal of trouble, and likely a considerable sum in unnecessary settlement as well, he said, looking up at her with the same warm admiration she had grown to treasure over their year of marriage. I do not know how I managed matters before you arrived to manage them so thoroughly yourself. You managed adequately, Eleanor said, smiling, though I confess I rather enjoy proving myself useful beyond simply defending elderly strangers at assemblies. The false claim collapsed entirely once Sebastian's solicitor presented the recovered documentation, and further investigation confirmed exactly what Sebastian had suspected from the beginning. The supposed half-brother had no genuine connection to the Caro family at all, but had been paid a modest sum by Edmund himself, still bitter over his public disgrace, to manufacture the entire scheme from France, safely distant from the consequences of failure. This time, Sebastian ensured the consequences reached Edmund fully and permanently. With the forged claim exposed and clear evidence of Edmund's involvement uncovered through the paper trail of payments, Sebastian pursued formal legal action that resulted in Edmund's complete removal from any remaining connection to the family name, along with criminal charges for fraud that ensured his troublemaking days had finally, truly come to an end. Margaret, upon hearing the full resolution, arrived at the estate specifically to celebrate the victory with them, settling into her favorite chair by the drawing-room window with the satisfied air of a woman who had waited a long time to see justice fully served. I confess I take a certain wicked pleasure in this outcome, she admitted, accepting a cup of tea from Eleanor with evident delight. Edmund spent years believing himself far cleverer than the rest of this family. It is rather satisfying to watch him finally understand otherwise. He underestimated Eleanor from the very beginning, Sebastian said, settling beside his wife with the easy affection that had only deepened over their year together. It seems to be a rather common mistake among those who oppose her. A mistake I intend for people to keep making, Eleanor said lightly. It does make certain confrontations considerably easier to win. As the autumn evening settled over the estate grounds outside, golden light fading slowly into the deepening blue of dusk, Eleanor found herself reflecting on how far the past year had carried them, from the frightened uncertainty of Edmund's first scheme to this comfortable, victorious evening surrounded by the family she had never expected to find. The threats had not entirely ended, she suspected. Families of such wealth and prominence rarely escaped every future challenge to their fortune or their name, but she found she no longer feared such challenges the way she once might have. She had learned, over the past year, that her own instincts, the same stubborn refusal to stay silent in the face of injustice that had first drawn Margaret's attention at that fateful assembly, remained her most valuable defense against whatever schemes the future might bring. Whether facing down cruel gossip in a crowded garden or uncovering generations-old documentation buried in dusty estate records, she had proven, again and again, that quiet courage and careful honesty could outlast even the most determined deception. Sebastian reached for her hand as the last light faded from the window, and Eleanor found herself smiling at the easy comfort of the gesture, so different from the guarded distance that had once defined their earliest encounters. They had built something lasting together, forged not through convenient circumstance but through repeated tests of trust, each one strengthening rather than weakening the foundation between them. Whatever comes next, Sebastian said quietly, echoing thoughts Eleanor had not yet spoken aloud. I find I no longer worry over it the way I once did. I have learned, this past year, that some partnerships are simply strong enough to weather whatever storms arrive uninvited. Then let them come, Eleanor said, leaning against his shoulder as the room settled into comfortable evening quiet. We have already proven we can weather a great deal more than most people realize. And in the warm glow of the estate's drawing room, surrounded by the mother who had first seen something extraordinary in her, the husband who had learned to trust fully despite every reason caution once gave him not to, and the quiet certainty that whatever challenges still lay ahead, they would face them exactly as they had faced everything before, together, honestly, and without fear, Eleanor allowed herself, at last, to simply rest in the happiness she had once thought far beyond her modest circumstances to claim. Outside, the last light faded fully from the autumn sky, and somewhere beyond the estate walls, London continued its endless churn of gossip and ambition, indifferent to the quiet victory won that evening within these walls. But Eleanor no longer measured her worth by what such a city whispered about her. She measured it instead by the steady hand resting in her own, by the mother who had claimed her as a daughter long before any wedding made it official, and by the simple, unshakable knowledge that a single act of kindness, offered freely on an ordinary evening, had carried her further than she ever could have imagined possible, into a life built not on fortune or title, but on the rare and lasting foundation of honesty freely given and faithfully returned.